Hey everyone! Today we're going to talk about real stories of people who believe objects can become vessels for something far more sinister. Dolls, in particular, are said to be among the most dangerous of all. These small figures, crafted in the likeness of human beings, their very shape, so close to our own, makes them easy vessels for the soul. When someone's deep, unresolved grief takes up residence inside that tiny body, the doll is no longer a simple toy. The story I'm about to tell you is a true account from one Japanese family. A grandmother who lost her newborn daughter decades ago. A French doll her husband bought to ease her grief. She gave the doll the same name as her dead child. And from that day forward, she held it close every single day. Then, strange things began to happen. A granddaughter was born. And right around the time the doll was displaced from its place of honor, terrible things started befalling the family, one by one. The doll's name was Chisu. It was never just a French doll. This is the story of the doll that tore one Japanese family apart from the inside out. So this story actually happened to a real family in Japan. The woman who shared the story, Yuki, was born into what looked like a perfectly ordinary Japanese household. Her parents, her grandmother, her younger sister, 5 people under one roof. But this family carried a painful secret. It happened long before Yuki was born. Her father had a sister, Yuki's aunt, though Yuki would never know her. This aunt died suddenly, just a few months after birth. The cause was never determined, unknown. The grandmother, who had waited so long for a daughter, then lost her in an instant, no one could imagine the depth of that grief. She wept every day, mourning the child she'd barely had. Her husband watched her fall apart, and eventually he couldn't take it anymore. One day, he came home with a small gift. A French doll. Small and beautiful, dressed in a pink gown, crafted so precisely it almost looked like a living child. He placed it in her hands, hoping it might fill, even slightly, the hole their daughter had left behind. What the grandmother did next shocked everyone. She gave the doll the same name as her dead daughter, Chisu. That was the name of the daughter she had lost, and now it became the doll's name too. From that day on, the grandmother treated it like her own flesh and blood. She stroked it gently every day, kept its clothes neat and clean, and at night she set it beside her pillow and slept next to it, as if her daughter had come back to life. Years passed. Yuki was born. But even then, even with a real granddaughter in the house, nothing in the grandmother's heart ran deeper than her attachment to the doll. She loved Yuki, yes, but not the way she loved Chisu. Then one day, Yuki's mother gave birth to another child, Yuki's little sister. And the moment that baby arrived, the grandmother transformed. She lit up in a way no one had seen before, as if her dead daughter had finally, truly come back. Since both of Yuki's parents worked, it fell naturally to the grandmother to raise the baby girl. She poured every drop of love she had into that little granddaughter, rocking her, soothing her, never putting her down, as if she were making up for every moment she'd been denied with Chisu. And it was right around that time that the doll's place in the house quietly began to shift. The grandmother moved Chisu out of her bedroom. She relocated the doll to a room the family rarely used, the Butsudan room. Traditional Japanese homes often have a putsuma, a room that houses the family altar, where the ancestral memorial tablets are kept. A sacred space not meant for everyday living. Dark, cold, faintly unsettling in a way that was hard to name. And that was where the doll Chisu was placed. The doll that had spent decades receiving the grandmother's nightly touch now sat alone on a shelf in that dark, cold room, as if its place had been stolen. But no one understood, not yet, what was happening in that room. And no one knew that the moment the doll was moved, terrible things would begin to happen to this family, one after another. Time passed. Yuki reached her 3rd year of middle school. By then, she had taken on an important role in the household, offering sake at the family altar, morning and evening. It was a traditional practice, a small ritual performed daily to honor the ancestors whose tablets rested in that room. Omiki tokuri. The pair of small ceremonial sake flasks placed before the altar. Every day, twice a day, Yuki filled them and carried them to the butsudan room. But it was never a task she looked forward to. The room was always dark, always cold. Even in the middle of summer, the moment you stepped through that doorway, a chill wrapped around you. The light never quite reached it. And inside, watching her from the shelf, the doll in the pink dress, Chisu, perfectly still, staring. Yuki always felt vaguely uncomfortable in that room. Something about the doll unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. Then one day, she went in as usual to make the offering, placed the 2 flasks carefully in front of the altar, pressed her hands together in prayer, and felt something behind her. The distinct, unmistakable sensation of eyes on her back, like someone standing just behind her, looking down. She spun around. Nobody there. Just the familiar darkness of the butsudan room. And Chisu sitting on the shelf in her pink dress, watching. In that moment, something in Yuki snapped. She was a teenager, at the peak of the age when you push back against things that scare you. The irritation that had been quietly building toward that doll finally boiled over. She opened her mouth and spoke directly to it. "What? You got a problem? Come on then." She had no idea how dangerous those words were. Yuki finished her prayer and walked back into the living room. Without really thinking, she mentioned it to her family. "Chizu in the butsudan room was glaring at me." The moment those words left her mouth, her grandmother's face, always gentle, always warm, went rigid with a fury Yuki had never seen before in her life. It was a terrifying warning. No one speaks carelessly about Chisu. No one. And then, to Yuki's shock, her father erupted too. He, who was never the type to fly into a rage, was suddenly matching the grandmother's fury. Yuki got scolded, hard enough that her father knocked her on the head. She apologized on the spot, and the incident seemed to close. But the real trouble came a few days later. It was a day off, and for once, a little light was making its way into the butsudan room. Yuki had forgotten to make the evening offering the night before, so she stepped in to do it now. She stopped dead. The doll in the pink dress, always sitting upright on its shelf, had fallen. It lay on the tatami floor below, and its wrist had come off. It had rolled a little distance from the body. Yuki's blood went cold. What disturbed her most was the position the doll had fallen into. It wasn't crumpled the way something falls. Its limbs were slightly bent, hands and feet angled in a way that looked unmistakably like something caught mid-crawl, like a figure frozen while pulling itself across the floor on all fours. And the direction it was facing, straight toward the doorway where Yuki stood. She screamed and ran. Yuki ran into the living room and found her grandmother there. She hesitated. She still remembered how badly things had gone last time. But the terror won. She told her grandmother everything. The doll on the floor, the wrist detached and rolled away. The grandmother's expression went stiff, but when she heard the trembling in Yuki's voice, she relented and went to see for herself. They walked into the butsudan room together. Yuki couldn't believe what she saw. The doll was back on the shelf, right there it always sat, wrist fully intact, as if nothing had ever happened. Yuki looked like a liar. She was stammering through an explanation when her father appeared. "Sorry, that was me. I knocked it over on my way to the bathroom. I put it back." He smoothed everything over and sent everyone on their way. The incident seemed to dissolve into nothing, just a mishap. But that night, after the grandmother had gone to bed, her father came quietly to Yuki's room and sat down beside her. "I did put the doll back. That part's true, but I didn't knock it over. He heard Yuki scream and rushed to see what had happened. The doll was lying on the floor, and not wanting another scene in front of the grandmother, he quickly picked it up and placed it back on the shelf. But he never touched the wrist. Yuki's skin prickled. If her father hadn't knocked it over, then how had it fallen? And if he had simply put the doll back on the shelf, why was the wrist back on the doll? She knew what she had seen. The wrist had been separated from the body. There was no explanation. There never would be. After that, Yuki became afraid to enter the Butsudan room at all. But the sake offering was still her job. She couldn't just stop. So she started cheating. She'd stand in the adjacent room for 2 or 3 minutes, then return to the living room, as if she'd just come back from making the offering. For over 6 months, the altar went without its daily sake. And then Yuki's little sister died. She had just started elementary school. One day, she spiked a fever, sudden, severe, origin unknown. She lost consciousness. They rushed her to the hospital, and that was the last time anyone in the family saw her awake. She was gone from a fever no one could explain. The whole family fell apart, and Yuki couldn't shake one thought. She had failed to make the offering for 6 months. Had she angered the ancestral spirits? Had they taken her sister because of what she'd done? She never said a word about it to anyone. Then Yuki's mother told them something that shook everyone to the core. She had been at her daughter's bedside in those final moments. And in those last moments, the little girl had cried out for someone. Chichang. The mother said it frightened her because her daughter had no friend, not one named anything close to that. So who had the little girl been calling for in the last moments of her life? The mother already knew the answer. It was the doll on the shelf in the Butsudan room. Chisu. The day of the little sister's funeral, Yuki's mother reached a breaking point. She stood up in front of everyone and made one demand. Get rid of the doll. Throw Chisu away right now. They could not keep in this house the thing that had taken her daughter. The grandmother refused. To her, Chisu was not a doll. Chisu had stood in for her dead daughter for decades. That doll was her child. In the middle of the funeral, Yuki's mother and grandmother screamed at each other in a way the family had never witnessed before. It was the last time the family was all together. Not long after the funeral, Yuki's mother left. She went back to her own parents' home and didn't come back. The remaining family came apart slowly. Yuki's father started drinking every night. After work, straight to a bar, home later and later, until eventually some nights he didn't come home at all. And the grandmother, every night, sat holding Chisu and weeping. The housework fell to Yuki. She was still a student. She hadn't finished school. But she was holding what remained of the household together alone. And then the grandmother's dementia began. She barely left her room except for meals. She would sit there with a doll clutched to her chest, staring at nothing, and then suddenly begin sobbing, crying until she exhausted herself and fell asleep. That became her daily rhythm. One day, Yuki went to call her grandmother for dinner. The grandmother was sitting on her bed, working her jaw, chewing something. "Grandma, what are you eating? Dinner's ready." Yuki took a step closer and froze. Something was hanging from the grandmother's mouth. A long, thin strand, gold-colored thread. In the grandmother's hands was the doll Chisu, half its hair torn away. The grandmother was eating the doll's hair. It was, Yuki said later, the single most terrifying thing she witnessed in her entire life. She pried the hair from the grandmother's mouth and made her retch. From that point on, the grandmother's behavior spiraled. She stopped loving the doll. Instead, she began to destroy it, methodically, obsessively. She pulled out all the remaining hair. She stripped and shedded the pink dress. She smeared it with her own waste. Yuki tried to take the doll away. She hid it. Every time she thought she'd put it somewhere unreachable, the next morning her grandmother had it again. The bathroom shelf, a corner of her parents' bedroom, the shoe cabinet. No matter where Yuki hid it, the grandmother would find it in the night, wandering the house, calling out, "Chisu, Chisu, where are you? Where are you?" And she always found it. Finally, Yuki had one idea left. She would keep the doll in her own room, on the second floor. Since the dementia had set in, her grandmother hadn't climbed those stairs a single time. That would be safe. It had to be. Yuki wrapped the doll tightly in a plastic bag and buried it deep in her closet. That night, at around 3 a.m, a sound woke her. "Chisu, Chisu." Cold sweat broke out across Yuki's back. The voice wasn't coming from downstairs. It was coming from right outside her door. She turned instinctively toward the closet. The doors were wide open. She had closed them firmly before bed. The plastic bag lay empty on the floor nearby. The doll was gone. While Yuki sat there in a silent panic, a voice came from just beyond the door. "Chisu, there you are." It was unmistakably her grandmother's voice. Yuki threw back her covers and rushed to the door. No one was there. No grandmother, no doll, both of them simply gone. Yuki crawled back under her blankets, pulled them over her head, and spent the rest of the night trying to convince herself it had all been in her head. But the next morning, in the soft, ordinary light of a bright day, Yuki opened her grandmother's door. The grandmother was dead. The cause of death was asphyxiation. Her esophagus was packed with Chisu's hair, pieces of torn pink fabric, and one of the doll's glass eyes. But even that wasn't the worst of it. The doll's severed head had been forced whole into the grandmother's mouth. No one could explain how. A human mouth should not have been able to hold it. Her grandmother's face was not peaceful. She had died in agony, her expression frozen in a rictus of pain, her eyes wide open and bloodshot, her body having released itself completely. In one hand, she still clutched the doll's headless body. The grandmother was buried quietly. The doll Chisu was cremated alongside her, reduced to ash. But near the end of the funeral, a relative pulled Yuki aside and told her something. The truth about her aunt, the baby who had died, the one whose name was Chisu, whose death had always been listed as unknown cause. It wasn't unknown. The grandmother had strangled her own newborn daughter with her bare hands. This was the secret the family had kept for decades. The reason was never determined. The act was simply buried and left to rot beneath the years. All those decades, the grandmother had spent clutching that doll, weeping over it, pouring her grief into it. That wasn't love for a lost child. It was guilt, bottomless, unresolvable guilt for the child she herself had killed. And Chisu, the doll, had absorbed every drop of it. 4 years had passed since the grandmother's death. Yuki no longer goes to school. She no longer does much of anything. She goes about her daily life and endures them. Maybe that too is the curse, not yet finished with her. Okay, that's the end of today's story, and as always, I will let you decide what to believe. Good night, everyone, and maybe don't look too closely at the dolls in your room. Bye, and see you in the next one.